Here we are at the confluence of the West Fork and the Clear Fork of the Trinity River. Skyscrapers, office buildings, highways, the signs of modernity are all around us. Behind me, though, is a sculpture of a man who arrived in the area well before any of this was here. His name was Major Ripley Arnold, an officer in the U.S. Army's 2nd Dragoons, and a veteran of the recently ended war between the United States and Mexico. At the behest of his commanding officers, he established Fort Worth here in 1849, officially to protect white settlers and Indians from one another. The Tarrant County Courthouse now occupies this land this Army post was on. While the frontier moved further west and the fort was dismantled in 1853, settlers who had moved to the shelter of the fort remained, and the city of Fort Worth began to grow. In the decades between the Civil War and the dawn of the 20th century, Fort Worth became a livestock center and a railroad hub, and both of these industries were instrumental in attracting the first Hispanics to the city. National and international events and trends influenced local political, economic, and social developments, including the growth of the city's Hispanic population. The U.S. Census first records Hispanic Fort Worthians in 1880. Sources over the next couple of decades reveal that the first barrios, or enclaves, centered around what is now downtown Fort Worth, including one called La Corte, located where the Trinity River campus of Tarrant County College now sits. Fort Worth's Hispanic population remained relatively small until the chaos and violence of the Mexican Revolution and its aftermath in the 1910s and 20s stimulated more Mexican immigration into Texas. By this time, Fort Worth was home to thriving meatpacking plants, steel mills, and rail yards, and many of those fleeing the violence in Mexico worked in and lived near these locations. Armour and Swift, two of the meatpacking giants of the early 20th century, had their plants adjacent to the stockyards. And while their once flourishing facilities have now fallen into ruin, the Mexican-American community on the city's north side that was attracted by the plentiful jobs in the meatpacking industry has continued to grow well into the 21st century. But other barrios were established in central Fort Worth, near the rail yards, and in south side near the steel mills. Though artificial barriers of racial prejudice limited the economic mobility of most of the first couple of generations of Hispanic Fort Worthians, some found an outlet by exercising their entrepreneurial abilities. Geronimo and Lola Piñera, from Spain and Mexico respectively, opened the original Mexican Eats Cafe on Camp Bowie in 1930. It's still there, by the way. Joe Garcia, who had arrived in Fort Worth in 1912, having fled the violence of the Mexican Revolution, established the now famous Joe T. Garcia's in 1935, just blocks away from where I stand now. Concentrated in numerous barrios across the city, many of these Mexican Americans were able to develop thriving institutions, successfully passing down cultural traditions to future generations. Religious and patriotic festivals bound the community together and reminded them of their shared spiritual and national heritage. And by mid-century, numerous individuals arose to play prominent roles within Fort Worth's growing Hispanic population. As historian Carlos Cuellar writes in his book Stories from the Barrio, A History of Mexican Fort Worth, whether from church, school, sports, military service, or politics, Mexicanos and Mexican Americans emerged at critical times to provide leadership for their community. For example, Raul Manriquez, a football star at Northside High School in the 1930s, went on to serve on a bomber crew flying missions over Germany during World War II. He survived being shot down and imprisoned in a POW camp. After retiring from the Air Force, he earned his bachelor's and master's degrees and became active in education and coaching athletics on the North Side. Rodolfo Rodriguez, whose family fled the Mexican Revolution in 1919, was first employed by Armour curing cowhides. Eager to strike out on his own, he later opened a pool hall, then bought a grocery store, both operating on the city's north side. After saving money from these enterprises, he then opened what later became known as Rodriguez Festive Foods Incorporated, an incredibly successful corporation distributing Mexican food products worldwide. The changing climate of the 1960s, with growing emphasis on civil rights nationwide, offered growing opportunities for Fort Worth's Hispanic population to become more politically active than their forebears. Pete and Juanita Zepeda, active in church and civic affairs on the north side since the 1940s, are good examples of these efforts. Juanita Zepeda was the first Hispanic resident of Fort Worth to run for city council, and though she lost, her involvement paved the way for future Hispanic leaders in the city. In 1973, Pete Zepeda helped organize the Greater Fort Worth Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and in 1983, the trustees of Tarrant County Junior College, now TCC, offered him a vacant seat on the board. Luis Zapata, born in 1934 in La Corte, went on to become Fort Worth's first Hispanic City Council member in 1977. There's much more to this story, of course, than the few individuals and enterprises I was able to highlight, a story that I encourage you to investigate further, in and out of the classroom. Fort Worth's Hispanic community has grown by leaps and bounds over the last 140 years, from barely 10 Hispanic residents in 1880 to being 35% of the city's current population of almost 900,000. One thing is clear: our community would not be the vibrant one that it is without the presence and contributions of Hispanic Fort Worthians.